Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. I have a favor to ask. I want you to listen for 90 seconds. It's only 90 seconds long. And I want you to listen to Micah Ovney. Micah Ovney made a video that appeared in my Twitter timeline on Sunday. And he makes this video to ask the Palestinian leadership a simple question. Why are you paying millions of dollars to the terrorist who murdered my father? Can't you find a better use for that money? Here's what he had to say.
My name is Micah Ovney, and this is my dad, Richard. My dad was a 76-year-old peace educator and civil rights activist when he was murdered by a Palestinian terrorist. Are you ready to hear something else insane? This is what Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas is paying the terrorist who stabbed and shot my father. A reward of almost $2 million. $2 million. I loved my dad very much. He wanted nothing more than peace. Look into my eyes. Can someone please explain to me how paying murderers is helpful for peace? Imagine your own father. Think of his smile. Think of his laugh. What if someone got millions of dollars for murdering him? How would you react? And what if the person who gave the terrorist that reward was wined and dined around the world like President Abbas is? President Abbas, can't you find a better use of money than paying the terrorist who murdered my father? I miss my dad every single day. Share this video to help keep his memory alive. Please, share this video if you agree that paying murderers only helps kill peace.
Why do I play that audio for you? Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, the Democrat from Minnesota, and Rashida Tlaib, the Democrat from Michigan, when they wanted to make their trip to Israel, and just to give you a heads up, I believe, and I'll explain why in just a second, I believe that Israel made a mistake in initially refusing visas for Omar and Tlaib to travel to Israel. I understand their reasoning for it, but I think if they'd wanted to have a greater impact, the Israelis, they would have let them in, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the point about playing that audio of Micah Ovney, is because both Congresswoman Omar and Tlaib wanted to meet with groups that support terrorism against Israel and that have published neo-Nazi screeds. If Omar and Tlaib were Republicans, this would be a major scandal. But since they're Democrats, the media is silent, and nobody except those in conservative media talk about the issue of why they wanted to go in the first place. Now it looks like both Congresswoman Omar and Congresswoman Tlaib have shared an awful Carlos Latouf cartoon in their Instagram stories on Saturday. Now, you probably don't recognize the name Carlos Latouf, and I wouldn't expect most people to. But back in 2006, Latouf came in second in Iran's International Holocaust Cartoon Contest. Yeah, that's a thing that actually exists. An International Holocaust Cartoon Contest. In case you thought that the world couldn't get any weirder or any worse than it already is, they shared a cartoon. And in sharing the cartoon, Rashida Tlaib said, and quoting Carlos Latouf, "The more they try to silence us, our voices rise. The more they try to weaken us, the stronger we become. The more they try to discredit us, the truth prevails." You know, what's amazing to me is for people that supposedly have been silenced by American government, which they have not, or silenced by the Israeli government, which they have not, for people that are supposedly silenced, they can't seem to shut up. They're heard everywhere. They continue to speak out against President Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, following the decision to bar them from visiting Israel last week. But now, recent social media posts from these two freshman congresswomen, part of that stupid, group. Some people refer it to as a squad, but I don't want to give them any more credit than they don't deserve any credit. But now from social media posts, including a political cartoon from an artist who is celebrated for his anti-Semitic imagery. They posted the Instagram stories and included a cartoon which depicts Netanyahu silencing Tlaib by covering her mouth and Trump doing the same to Omar. Here's why I think the Israelis made a mistake. These two women, in my opinion, it goes beyond anti-Semitism. It is truly hatred of Jewish people. It's out and out racism. The hatred of the Jewish people by these two members of the United States Congress is unlike anything I've seen in my entire lifetime. And I'm getting pretty damn old, and I've seen a lot. Here's why I think the Israelis made a mistake. Now, to be clear, those of you who haven't followed the story, let me explain that when the Israelis refused a visa, then Rashida Tlaib decided that she's the one from Michigan. She decided that she would apply for a visa on humanitarian grounds because she wanted to go see her 90-year-old grandmother. And so she wrote a letter on United States congressional letterhead. She wrote a letter to the foreign minister asking for a visa on humanitarian purposes because she wanted to go see her ailing 90-year-old grandmother. By the way, I've seen video of her 90-year-old grandmother, and I would say she's anything but ailing, but set that aside. She wanted to go see her 90-year-old grandmother because, in her words, this might be the last time that she would be able to see her. And she promised in the letter that if you would grant this visa on humanitarian grounds to visit her grandmother, she would not talk about the BDS movement. She would not make any anti-Israeli or anti-Semitic screeds while she was on Israeli soil. And so the foreign minister agreed and said, I will grant you a visa on humanitarian grounds. And that's when Rashida Tlaib turned around and said, never mind, I don't want your stupid visa anyway. She used her grandmother. She unequivocally used her grandmother as a political pawn because they so despise Israel and they so despise Jews that they actually engage in Iranian anti-Holocaust propaganda. So here's why I think the Israelis made a mistake. These women should have been allowed to travel to Israel because you've heard the old saying, when somebody's hanging themselves, just keep giving them more rope. And allowing these two dipwads, Omar and Tlaib, to travel to Israel probably would have emboldened them. And on Israeli soil, they would have felt empowered. They would have felt the freedom to engage in probably even worse anti-Semitic behavior, anti-Semitic language, anti-Semitic screeds. They would have hung themselves, figuratively, while on Jewish soil. And I think the Israelis would have been better off because they could have then kicked them out of the country or just ignored them altogether. And even though the New York Times probably would have ignored it, and New York Times itself is sometimes, I believe, anti-Semitic, but they would have shown their true colors to even a greater degree than they have so while on American soil. I wish the Israelis would have let them travel to Jerusalem or to the West Bank or to wherever they wanted to go and just see what they had to say. Micah Avni grieves for his father who was killed by Hamas. Mahmoud Abbas offered a $2 million reward, not for the capture of his father's murderer, but for the identification He wants to reward that man or woman, whoever it might be, or child, who knows, wants to reward them with a $2 million bounty. I don't get the rise in anti-Semitism, but it's very dangerous. And it's even more dangerous considering the fact that the citizens of this country have elected two of the most anti-Israel, anti-Jewish members of Congress in the history of this country. Ilhan Omar, a Democrat from Minnesota, Rashida Tlaib, a Democrat from Michigan. I say, let them speak. Let them hang themselves. So why is this anti-Semitism running amok? Because, listen to this. In this soundbite, you'll hear the New York Times admit, hey, we're not covering it, and maybe we should.
Rashida Tlaib from entering Israel based on Trump's bullying him into that position. He reversed course. Now, that's a huge story, one that I wrote a column about. But another huge story, one that has not been covered by any mainstream paper or network, is the fact that their trip to Israel, or as they called it, Palestine, was being sponsored by a group that literally published neo-Nazi blood libels and said that it supported female suicide bombers, hailing them as heroes. That's a scandal. If someone like Steve King was going to Sweden or Norway and meeting with neo-Nazi groups, that would be front page news. One of the questions I think we need to ask is the fact that Trump has lodged racist, horrible attacks on these women, has that made them sort of untouchable for us to cover in an accurate way? I think that's one of the problems of this moment, that it's very hard to cover sort of complicated characters and stories like them because the president, everything he touches becomes toxic.
I'll be right back. You've probably heard by now that there were protests in Portland over the weekend. Of course, there are always protests in Portland. But here's what really bugs me about the protest. Now, and I don't remember the gentleman's name, and it's immaterial, but here's what you do need to know about protests. There were two competing protests. There was what you would consider to be a far right, maybe even, I'm trying to be generous here, maybe even a white supremacist, a white nationalist protest on the one side, and then on the other side there was the Antifa, the anti-fascist protest on the other side. So you had a far-right protest and a far-left protest. And, of course, this time the Portland mayor, who's also the Portland police commissioner, came out, and I think he had virtually every member of the Portland Police Department on active duty over the weekend. I heard there were more than 1,000 cops that were called in to try to maintain the peace. And for the most part, they actually did maintain the peace because for the most part, they actually kept the two groups apart. But here's what drives me crazy about it. You know that I probably say this every Monday in every Monday podcast, but I watch CBS Sunday Morning. And I like the program because it's more about culture, and it's more, instead of being a news magazine, it's more of a cultural magazine. And this past Sunday's program was about, they were broadcasting, obviously it was all taped, but they were broadcasting from Florence, Italy. And so there were great stories about Michelangelo and the Statue of David. There were great stories about Tuscany, and it was just a really good episode. But when Jane Pauley threw it back to New York for let's get the headlines on this Sunday, August 18, 2019, they threw it back to a New York CBS studio, and whoever the little newsreader was talked about the Portland protests. I don't know how to describe it other than this. She talked about the Portland protests and said that there was a far-right group on the one hand, and there was Antifa on the other hand, which is an anti-fascism group. Now, if you understand Antifa at all, yes, they claim to be anti-fascist, but they are indeed themselves fascist because they stand for tyranny. They stand for a statist or authoritarian government. They want to shut down free speech. The only speech they want to have is their speech. They are truly the fascists. I wouldn't have been so upset or pissed off if instead of describing, on the one hand, you had a far-right group, and on the other hand, you had a far-left group. That, to me, would be somewhat objective. But when you describe, on the one hand, a far-right group, and on the other hand, you have Antifa, who is anti-fascist, you leave the ignorant or the non-discerning consumer of news to think, oh, yeah, there were those far-right nut jobs on the right. And then there was this group, on the other hand, that's anti-fascism. Oh, bless their little pea-picking hearts. The group on the left is anti-fascist. Congresswoman Holland, who is a Democrat from the area, was on CNN. She says that Antifa are peaceful protesters trying to safeguard their city.
Real quick, I just want to read you the tweet from President Trump this morning regarding what's happening in Portland. And, you know, this is where we see people who are so-called white supremacists, some of these groups that are at the very least, you know, far-right extremists clashing with other groups, including Antifa, which is, you know, seen as a far-left organization. And he writes, major consideration is being given to naming Antifa an organization of terror. Portland is being watched very closely. Hopefully the mayor will be able to properly do his job. And I do want to note the U.S. doesn't have a domestic terrorism law, and no government agency designates domestic groups as being terrorist organizations. What's your reaction to that tweet?
So, you know, this is on par with what the president does. He sides with the white supremacists. He sides with the white nationalists, with the domestic terrorists in our country, just as, you know, he's incited violence against people of color. Portland is a progressive city. They want to ensure that they keep their city moving forward. It's not surprising that Trump would side away from the folks who are the peaceful protesters working to safeguard their city from domestic terrorism. Just not surprised at all that the president sides with the white nationalists. That's been his mode of operation since before he was elected president.
And there you have it. This is what I mean. This is so easy. This is like just hitting softballs. But this is what I mean about you must learn to be a discerning consumer of news, because if you're not, and you listen to CNN, well, if you listen to CNN for any length of time, you'll go bat crap crazy. But this is how they present and reinforce the stereotype that those on the far right, well, they're the nut jobs, but those on the far left, well, they're just trying to protect their city. They're the peaceful ones. Antifa as peaceful? Anybody with an IQ above room temperature knows that Antifa is anything but nonviolent. We have moved into, I think, an era of Orwellianism, unlike anything we've seen before. And I know that I've already, in the first two stories of this podcast, I've talked about that unlike anything I've seen before. And I oftentimes criticize people for talking about, well, I've never seen anything like this before, because, well, their perspective is from the time they were kind of self-aware to the present day when they make that statement. So maybe I'm guilty of the same thing too. And there have been awful times in our country. But I don't think there's ever been a time when the media itself is so Orwellian that they would actually take this woman, who, by the way, she's from New Mexico. She is not from Oregon. I misspoke. That they would have this woman on and let her describe Antifa as being a nonviolent organization that is trying to just simply to protect their own city of Portland. And it's not challenged whatsoever. And it's not challenged because that's the narrative that they want, even though CNN has, at best, I think the best program they have might have 900,000 viewers. So it's nowhere near the audience that the networks have or that Fox News has. But nonetheless, they're reinforcing to their little bubble, the people that listen to them, that, oh, yeah, They're the right-wing nut jobs, and Antifa's just that peaceful group trying to protect their city. Now, I don't want to silence the media for describing Antifa that way, because let me give you an example of how this is beginning to backfire. You want to talk about somebody that's about as far left as they come. Andy Lassner. Andy Lassner is the producer of Ellen DeGeneres' afternoon talk show. He is a far left-wing nut job. He tweeted out over the weekend, he tweeted out on Saturday, this: "Hey, Antifa, whoever you are, how about you cut it the F out? You're putting millions and millions of us in a position where the right wants us to defend something we want no part of. You don't represent me. Go home." This is another example of the left eating the left. While CNN is over here trying to give cover to Antifa, the producer of the Ellen Show, who's far left-wing, I mean, he's probably, in all honesty, he's probably an avowed socialist. He's probably an authoritarian, as most socialists are. But as the executor of the Ellen Show, he's a reliable progressive voice on Twitter. But today he took this bold stand against Antifa, telling the black-clad militants, "You don't represent me." But you know, just as President Trump is vilified for calling neo-Nazis very fine people, something he never did, some people see things only in black and white, only in a binary this or that. If you don't support Antifa, then you're obviously a fascist. There's no middle ground. How are the higher-ups going to like hearing that Lassner supports fascism? He doesn't support fascism, or at least he proclaims that he doesn't. And he sees what Antifa truly stands for and is telling them to shut the F up. You don't represent me and you don't speak for me. Well, I wonder why. The Antifa mob in Portland over the weekend, yelling at police officers using the C word, Uncle Tom, and race traitor. They just hassled and harassed the cops the entire time. I'd like to play the video, but I don't want to spend most of my day bleeping out the C word and the F-bombs and everything else. But suffice it to say, that's exactly what they did. You know, there was a cop last week, it may have been Thursday or Friday, I forget when, but there was a New York Police Department cop that committed suicide. And I apologize, I forget the number of NYPD officers that have now committed suicide this year, but it's a staggering number. Remember the Philadelphia shootout? Well, while those cops were doing everything they could to either shoot that dirtbag who was boarded up in some row house in Philadelphia, the neighbors were harassing the cops, shouting at them, throwing things at them, doing everything while they were trying to protect the lives of Philadelphia citizens, while they were trying to take the dirtbag out. The people in the neighborhood were harassing the cops. I don't believe, I had this conversation over the weekend again at dinner. I remember hearing from my grandfather, I remember hearing from my parents, I remember hearing from Tamara's dad about how this country was kind of denigrating into this cycle of where eventually, if we didn't kind of stand up and kind of regain our principles, that we very might delve into fall into another civil war. And I said over the weekend that I didn't think that I would ever see that possibility in my lifetime. Now, I still don't think it's necessarily is going to happen, although anything could spark it at any given moment. I still don't think it's going to happen. But I also never believed that I would live in times where I thought that there would be the kind of kindling that a simple spark might set off a civil war in this country. I just didn't think I'd live in that time period. But when you see the absolute, and look, I to some degree am anti-authoritarian. I really believe strongly in individual liberty and individual freedom. And I think whenever the government tries to step in and stifle individual liberty and stifle individual freedom, I tend to revolt and repulse against that. Always have my entire life. I'm not an anarchist. I think we do need rules and regulations, and we need to order our civil society. But I'm beginning to see that on the edges that orderliness, whatever the word is, of our civil society is becoming frayed. There was also, although they ended up being a nothing burger, there was organized over the weekend a parade, a rally in Philadelphia. And the rally was not for the cops who were trying to save the lives of people in that neighborhood and trying to take out the dirtbag that was trying to kill them, but it was going to be a rally for the dirtbag that was shooting at the cops. Now, fortunately, maybe a couple of dozen people showed up, so it was pretty much a bust. But the very idea that you would hold a rally for a man who was not even killed by the cops, that SWAT team in the Philadelphia Police Department allowed that dirtbag and his lawyer to negotiate to allow a hands up, don't shoot, turn myself in, walk out of the apartment building, and immediately be arrested and hauled off to the Philadelphia jail. Well, good for the Philadelphia cops for doing it that way. Otherwise, it would have been one of my taxpayer relief shots. But to think about everything that those cops endured, those who were injured, those who risked life and limb, and then to think that there was going to be a rally for the guy who was trying to kill the cops. That's what I mean by we live with a bunch of kindling around us, and all it's going to take is a spark somewhere, somehow, when we least expect it. Hang on, I'll be right back. So the New York Post has a hilarious story up. I don't know why I find it funny, but it looks like the TSA is now hiring the cast of Mean Girls. There's a traveler that was going through security at the Rochester International Airport that got an unexpected sick burn from an employee when the TSA employee, I refuse to call them officers, handed him a folded-up note that said, "You ugly." Neil Strassner, 40, said he was handed the small, folded-up piece of brown paper by a female worker while he was collecting his things at the checkpoint back in June. He said that initially he just thought it was some sort of scrap cardboard or a piece of trash or something. He says, "I didn't open it because I didn't care about it." She turned around a few times asking, "Are you going to open that?" In other words, "Hey, look at the note. Look at the note." Well, I didn't open it because I didn't care about it. But then she kept turning around asking, "Are you ever going to open that?" So he finally did. He looked at it. He saw the message. He said he just put it in his pocket, got on his plane to Kansas. But in CCTV, closed-circuit TV footage of the incident, you can see the guard doubling over with laughter as the passenger walks away. She then tears another piece of cardboard from a box of latex gloves above the bag scanner and begins writing apparently a message for the next victim. This is TSA. Thousands standing around. Ugh. You know, I still challenge people to explain to me how TSA, as opposed to the private screeners that we had before TSA, how they make us safer. And if you don't understand the vulnerabilities the airports still pose with baggage and all of the employees that work on the sterile or secure side of the airport, if you don't understand how people travel back and forth, if you don't understand how TSA itself is a threat to airport safety, you haven't been listening or paying attention. Hang on, I'll be right back. I don't know what I find more fascinating, what's happening in Hong Kong or what's happening in Russia. Wait a minute, Russia, you say? I've heard about Hong Kong, but what about Russia? Well, first from Hong Kong. Water cannon trucks were being kept on standby as pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong marched through the dense city center after assembling at Victoria Park on a rain-soaked Sunday afternoon, according to the South China Morning Post. All of these thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of demonstrators filled the streets to the extent that there was not enough space in the park. Now, the cops had approved the rally, but they had objected to any plan to march to the central business district because of the previous clashes that had occurred there. But these protesters, after having, through social media and other means, told each other, we're going to be peaceful. So they defied the cops' instructions and they marched anyway. By mid-afternoon, the park was completely filled with tens of thousands of people. The protesters brought traffic on the multi-lane main road in the Causeway Bay shopping district to a complete halt. The crowd started inching toward the park, shouting, "People of Hong Kong, keep fighting." Now, China's pissed off about this. Now, Trump, of course, has tried to be a little diplomatic and not say a whole lot. And while I complained about it earlier, I kind of get it. But members of Congress, both House and Senate, are beginning to say things like, we need to support them. China needs to back off and not do anything. Well, that's ticking off China. A spokesperson for China's legislature condemned statements from U.S. legislators that were supporting the protesters. Yu Wins called the statements by senators and congressmen a gross violation of the spirit of the rule of law, a blatant double standard, and a gross interference in China's internal affairs. Just by saying, hey, don't do anything violent against the protesters. And they violated the law here. They gathered in the park. It spilled over into the streets, but there was no violence. But this from Russia, I don't think you hear much about this. Russian opposition activists staged a string of pickets in central Moscow on Saturday, calling for free elections and for charges against protesters that had been detained at recent rallies, that those charges be dropped. I have to admit, I've missed this story. But Moscow has been rocked by weekly protests for more than a month now, since the communist authorities barred opposition candidates from running in an election for the city's legislature next month. The cops have detained more than 2,000 protesters in recent weeks, launched criminal cases against about a dozen people for mass disorder, used force to disperse what they said were illegal protests, and the recent opposition demonstrations have turned into the biggest sustained protest movement since 2011 and 2013, back when protesters took to the streets against perceived electoral fraud. And of course, Russia is also dealing with the fallout from the explosion of a small nuclear reactor last week that left 5 scientists dead. That blast occurred back on August 8 during a test of a missile that used isotope power sources. Now, the Russian nuclear company Rosatom said over the weekend, and the defense ministry initially reported that 2 were killed in the accident, which said it involved testing of a liquid-fueled missile engine. But they didn't mention anything about the nuclear element. It did cause a spike in radiation in a nearby port city. It comes after a series of massive explosions earlier last week at a Siberian military depot. There's a lot of horrible stuff going on, actually good stuff, but a lot of horrible things going on also. Russia's got its big problems too. The whole world seems to be in turmoil, and I find it fascinating. I'll be right back. So let's go out to California for a little bit. There was an article in Friday's Wall Street Journal, and the title of the article was, California's Biggest Cities Confront a It's a crisis. What do you think the crisis is? They're confronting a defecation crisis. The subheadline says it all. Lawmakers ban plastic straws as far worse kind of waste covers the streets of San Francisco and L.A. It goes on to talk about their SF-31 map in San Francisco, part of its San Francisco at Your Service program. It allows residents to upload a photo of any offending specimen directly to the SF-311 website. It's part of their 5-person poop patrol. Oh, honey, look. Imagine you've decided to go to the Golden Gate City, and you're in California, and you're walking along Market Street, you're up in Union Square, you're down in the Embarcadero, and you're just strolling along, enjoying the sights and sounds of the city, and it's like, oh, look, there's a big pile of human waste over there. Honey, can we take a picture? Let's take a picture and send it up to the SF-311 website. There are now at least 3 maps that chart the location of poop complaints in the city. The website RealtyHop.com dubbed San Francisco the doo-doo capital of the United States. They noted that the city's poop reports, can you believe we're even talking about this? They noted that the city's poop reports almost tripled between 2011 and 2017. Now, I know it would be easy, and I think rightfully so. It would be easy, and there would be a causal link between the city's Democrat governance and Democrat policies and this problem of poop on the city of L.A. and San Francisco. Now, the problem draws attention because the poop is increasingly not from dogs but from humans. Now, when you stop and you think about that, Impartial Defense of the City, Curbed San Francisco's Adam Brinklow, explains that the report submitted to the city didn't distinguish between human and dog excrement and that there were 150,000 dogs and fewer than 10,000 homeless people within the city limits. But he admits, just that statement alone doesn't tell you anything. There could be 1 million dogs in San Francisco and only 5,000 homeless people. And if all the homeless people are pooping in the streets, but yet people are pooping up scooping up the poop from their dogs, well, nobody would care, right? But this guy admits that homelessness was probably the leading edge of the problem in San Francisco as well as L.A., where 36,000 people live on the streets. Now, here's what I found interesting in the story. Because when you stop and think about it, where did this problem come from? Because have we always had this problem? Has it always been like this? There was not a defecation crisis, a term that's usually associated with rural India, back in the 1930s. Back in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, unemployment hovered around 25%. Vagabonds were roaming the country. Shanty towns, Hoovervilles were springing up everywhere. Yet we never read about anywhere in the newspapers. If you go back and you dig through the archives, you don't find any historical records of problems of poop in the streets, despite unemployment being at 25%. Today's homeless and the hobos of the Great Depression are really different. The triple scourges of drug abuse, mental illness, family breakdown have produced derangements far deeper than those seen in the 1930s, when the widely shared nature of the economic and psychological distress provided its own grim comfort. And I don't mean to at all say because there was no defecation problem back in the 30s during the Great Depression and draw some sort of parallel to modern times. I think it truly is a breakdown of American civilization. A poop defecation crisis. There's also in the story, I found this story, or this part of the article, amazing. The majority of the nation's homeless people now live in California. And they try to say that there are myriad causes at work, but there was no, as they say, defecation crisis back in the 1930s. So what is causing this crisis now? Yeah, I do think it's probably drug-induced. I think it's mental illness. I think it's a breakdown of the family. But I also think it's much larger than that. I think it's a breakdown of personal responsibility. I think it's a breakdown of yes, and part of that stems from the family. Part of that stems from drug abuse. Some of that stems from just, any number of things. But the problem is we have created an entire generation that doesn't think it's responsible for anything. And then when you stop and you think about what Democrats are offering in the 2020 election at the presidential level in particular, what are the policies that they're providing? You don't have to pay for anything. You don't have to be responsible for your debts. For a long time there was a tweet that was floating around on my Twitter timeline for about 4 or 5 days. And it was some kid, I say kid, I don't know how old he was, 20-something, 30-something, I don't know, I don't care. And he was talking about how much debt he was in, not only from student loans, but just from debt in general, and he was never going to get out of that debt. And I thought to myself, and of course a lot of people were bashing him and people were saying awful things about him, but I didn't want to engage in that. Instead, I just sat and I looked at the guy and I thought, well, all of these debts that you took on knowingly. And now, what are the Democrats telling us? Well, we're going to forgive those debts. We're going to just forgive them. I keep hearing on radio and television advertisements that talk about, if you have credit card debt of greater than $10,000, we'll call this 800 number and we'll be able, you don't have to pay off your credit card debt. Think about the message that says. We are, for just anybody that's just casually listening, they think there's some escape valve out there. That, well, I can go into this debt, whether it be for student loans, credit card debts, whatever it might be. And look, I absolutely get that sometimes people are thrust into debt that they didn't ask for, medical problems. But medical debt, I guess lawyers will correct me if I'm wrong, you can't discharge student loan debt in bankruptcy. You can, however, discharge unsecured debt, which is what a medical debt would be, assuming they haven't sued you yet, that they haven't gotten a lien on your house, for example, and converted an unsecured debt into a secured debt. But most unsecured debts are not, they are dischargeable in bankruptcy. So why do we have advertisements that keep talking about, well, if you have more than $10,000 in debt, or the other one that drives me nuts, if you owe the IRS more than $10,000, call us, and we'll get you off. You won't have to pay as much. Everywhere you turn, we seem to be saying to people, you will not be held responsible for your actions. And so I keep going back to that kid, thinking about that kid that kept showing up in my Twitter timeline. So he has all this debt from school. Well, he chose that debt. He could have chosen instead to work part-time and go to school part-time and work enough to pay the tuition. And yeah, he might not graduate in 3 or 4 years. It might take him 5 or 6 years. But we somehow want this instant gratification, and we want to, right now, solve the problem right now. Back to the defecation crisis. I think the defecation crisis is a lot like you don't have to pay your student loan debt. You don't have to pay your credit card debt. You don't have to pay your taxes. You don't have to do anything, including go to a toilet. You can just poop right there. I'll be right back. When I listen to all the Democrats talking about white supremacy, white nationality, which is kind of replacing racism, they need to move on from the Russia collusion. So now we're going to, they went to racism and now they're going from racism to white nationalism, white supremacy. I almost think that a lot of these people would actually revel in whites being a minority in America. And there is a demographic shift going on, and there's no question about it. And I don't fear it. It's just a matter of, it just is what it is. But in the meantime, the bureaucrats at the University of South Dakota demand that people stop, and in particular whites, stop taking up space in the country, the country that whites created. This came to light in a diversity orientation presentation inflicted on law students. Here's how Campus Reform reported it. Within the various slides is a flow chart that asks students to assess whether or not they are, quote, taking up space or, quote, contributing to a space. One slide uses a flowchart to guide students through answering this question by assessing whether or not they are deferring to minoritized, yeah, we make words out of everything, right? Minoritized voices during discussions. So I guess the higher a politically preferred identity group has climbed on the cultural Marxist totem pole, the more minoritized it can claim to be. White males who are not perverts or Muslims already constitute a minority of the population. But being at the very bottom of the liberal caste system, they score 0 on the minoritization scale, and therefore they must defer obsequiously to everybody else. You know, racial animus against whites has really emerged as truly a cardinal feature of progressivism. The coming white minority is not going to fare very well with progressives in charge. I don't know what that means in terms of how whites will react to it. But when you're treated like that, when you're treated with disdain, and you are moving into the minority, I don't think people are going to take very kindly to it. As I say, I just think it's a matter of demographics, and it's going to be what it is. Am I in the minority? Will I be in the minority? I don't know. I just want my individual liberty, my individual freedom. That's what any of us should care about. That and that alone. There's a great video on YouTube that I want to share with you. It's Jason Siller's top 10 contradictions of the left. The top 10 contradictions of the left. See if this doesn't just make your head spin.
Number 10.
They fight to make women's sports just as important as men's sports, and then they fight to allow men to play in women's sports. Boy, these guys must really feel like they fit in when they instantly become the best player on the team and the only one with an Adam's apple.
Number 9.
They think anyone under the age of 26 is too young to provide for their own health insurance, but they think a 16-year-old is wise enough to vote in our elections. But not before they had to legislate rules on laundry detergent packaging so that these potentially new voters would quit eating it.
Number 8.
They constantly talk about there being strength in diversity, but then they tell us that we should be more like Finland or Norway, a couple of the least diverse countries on the planet. They're not just white, they're bright white.
Number 7.
They're willing to kill a baby on the day they're supposed to be born, but they want a baby killer to die of old age. And then they even want to give them back the right to vote. For Democrats, of course, because Republicans are for the death penalty.
Number 6.
They tell us that if we don't cut back on our CO2 emissions, the planet will be destroyed. And they're willing to fly all over the world to convince us. In their private jets. How selfless.
Number 5.
They want open borders, but they keep the gates to their own communities locked. They'll make the UPS guy show his ID at the guard shack, but they just want to take the word of an illegal alien at the border. I'm sure those are his kids. Only about 15,000 women and children are trafficked across the border every year, so there's no real reason to verify if he's telling the truth.
Number 4.
They think our president is the next Hitler, and at the same time, they want to take our guns away. Well, he's in charge. You know, the guy they call the next Hitler. For some reason, they think it's a good idea that he has all the guns.
Number 3.
They think voter ID laws are racist, but don't seem to mind if blacks don't have an ID to get a bank account or rent an apartment or fly on an airplane or get Social Security benefits, even though they've never paid into the system. Because how could they ever get a job? They don't even have the wherewithal to get an ID. That's according to the Democrats.
Number 2.
They don't think you should judge people by the color of their skin. And then they claim that all white people are racist, even if they don't know it. Plus, they don't think black people can secure an identification card. Did I mention that already?
Number 1.
They claim to be tolerant, but want to shut down anyone who disagrees with their worldview. They'll even organize a group of people to protest at your house and demand you get fired from your job, all to prove just how intolerant you are.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, Mr. Siller, the top 10 contradictions of the left. I'll be right back. You know, as long as we're talking about the lunacy of the left, the more it feeds on itself, the more ravenous the left becomes. Now academia is telling us that acquiring food by milking cows is literally the equivalent of sexual abuse. Titled, Readying the Rape Rack, Feminism and the Exploitation of Non-Human Reproductive Systems. It's a paper that was published Friday in a journal called Dissenting Voices. Well, this paper is apparently, or this journal is published and edited by the Women's and Gender Study, I rest my case, Your Honor, by the Women's and Gender Study program at the college at Brockport State University of New York. The published piece aims at discussing the sexual exploitation of non-human bodies, especially dairy cows. Now, it will not be legal to sexually exploit cows by milking them when utopia has been achieved, apparently. According to this publication, the dairy industry is a host for sex-based discrimination and a site where sexual assault and objectification based on biological makeup are highly prevalent but ignored as we choose to neglect non-humans with whom we share a planet. Oh, I can't find it. I have to see if I can find it. I ran across a story over the weekend about the drive to make certain that dogs are eating the same kind of food and as well as human beings. Why don't we just let them fend for themselves? How about that? But anyway, back to milking cows is the equivalent of sexual abuse. Apparently, according to lefties, there's no meaningful difference between a cow and a human being. When Peter's Ingrid Newkirk proclaimed that a rat is a pig, as a dog is a boy, get it? A rat is a pig, as a dog is a boy, she could have added, is a cow. If it ever occurs to academics and animal rights militants that cows would hardly exist if we did not raise them for food, have you ever thought about that? They'd probably just die out. PETA will probably call for the welfare state to be expanded to finance cow preserves. I can see it now. Hey, honey, instead of going to the wildlife preserve, let's go to the cow preserve. The paper argues that in order to fully fight gendered oppression, society must also address the plight of dairy cows, which it asserts are still subjects to sex-based discrimination and violence, despite their voices not always lifted or comprehensible. I haven't actually talked to a cow for a while, but I may try to go out to a feedlot somewhere and see if I can't walk around and talk to the cows a little bit and find out whether or not their voices are being lifted or whether or not their voices are comprehensible. You know, it's really not easy to comprehend the voices of cows. I've been around cows. I've never understood anything they said. But those guilty of clinging to an anthropocentric orientation may even believe that moo doesn't really mean anything in particular. The author, Mackenzie April, an intern for Brockport's Women's Studies Department, hopes the publication will inspire feminists and other social justice-minded individuals to do what? To incorporate non-human bodies into their own feminist perspectives. The Moo Too movement? Instead of the Me Too movement, we need the Moo Too movement. You know, to a potentially disastrous extent, feminists have really prevented us from reproducing. Now let's see if they can prevent us from eating. Hang on, I'm going to have a hamburger. I'll be right back. Now, ladies, you can laugh about the next story, and some men are going to be squeamish about the next story. In fact, well, I'm a little squeamish about the next story, but it's not like it affects me at all, because it totally doesn't. But I, for sure, maybe have some friends who might find this interesting, but not me. This story is for other people. This comes from Vice magazine. According to historians that spoke with Vice, the ancient Greeks actually used to prefer small and dainty penises on men, partly because the Greeks were all about balance, and anything too big would be perceived as out of balance, or maybe it might cause you to be unbalanced. I don't know. Well, that might be good enough reasoning for Aristotle, but apparently not for the girls that you meet with on Tinder or whatever. Well, that preference seems to have spread beyond ancient Greece to the Romans, the Egyptians, and even all the way into medieval Christian society. The Greeks, Romans, all of them used big penises on comic relief and stories and plays because they found them so gross and ridiculous and stupid. Medieval artists, if you don't believe this, just go to Vice. Medieval artists used huge penises to get a laugh as well, but also to depict somebody as heretical or even straight up evil. I mean, isn't that interesting? Of course, a man packing a piglet, being society's preferred male standard, didn't survive to this modern age of American exceptionalism. Nowadays, if you're, couldn't win a ribbon at the state fair, you might as well resign yourself to a life of sadness and second-place finishes. Like that makes sense. You think storming the beaches at Normandy would have been easy with your, flapping around all around your knee? Nope. Those brave men's penises were practically fully retracted thanks, probably to the cold water and being scared to death. Small penises defeated Hitler. Yes. Let's be honest. Small penises defeated Hitler. Now, to be fair, Hitler was also purported to have a small penis, and maybe he was such an angry guy because everybody made fun of it. Did you ever think about that? Maybe that's what Hitler's entire problem was. That a Europe more accepting of penises of all shapes and sizes could have prevented World War II? Never thought about that? Did your history teacher ever teach you about that? Me either. This is no longer a world for the man with a reasonably sized penis. We are a society now that values moderation. Sad, but fashion, culture, everything is oftentimes cyclical, so maybe one day tiny penises will be in vogue again. We can only hope. Not me, but obviously maybe you. Not me, you. There's a story attached in the footnotes to this Vice story about why you should visit the world's largest penis museum. I'm not even going to go there today. Nope, I'm not going there. And speaking of penises, and I don't know who was, but there's no other way to segue into this. But a new survey conducted by Tommy John, the underwear, and I guess they sell other stuff too. I don't know. I don't think I own anything that has the word Tommy John on it. And I'm not really sure I want to wear anything that has the words Tommy John on it. But anyway, this survey the survey says that 45% of Americans wear the same pair of underwear for 2 days or more. Seriously? The company allegedly conducted a survey of 2,000 men and women to see how long people keep their underwear on. According to Tommy John Underwear, 32% of Americans aren't even sure how long they've had their oldest pair of underwear or how long they've worn them. But the company did find that there were 2.5 times more likely than that men were, to wear the same underwear for a week or more. Seriously, guys? Now, I would say I've seen men wear the same jeans for 4 days in a row. I might believe that. In fact, I keep reading it, but I can't bring myself to do it. I keep reading everywhere about you should never wash your Levi's. That if you spill something on them, you're supposed to take a damp cloth and you're supposed to, kind of dab or daub the stuff out of it. I just can't do it. I can go maybe a week without washing my Levi's. Does that gross you out? I cannot do the whole never wash your jeans thing. So back to Tommy John. The company also found that 46% of Americans have owned the same pair of underwear for a year or more. Well, yeah, I've got underwear I've owned for, I don't know. Just over half of those surveyed said they change their underwear every day, which should be more than half if you ask me. I'm just bodily fluids, germs. Come on, people. What's wrong with this? This is what's wrong with America. We have defecation crisis in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and we have more than half of Americans who wear their underwear more than 2 days in a row. Now, I don't have to tell you why this whole study is disgusting and just plain wrong. It's gross. Everyone knows. Did your mother not teach you this? You should swap out your old underwear for a pair of new ones every 6 months or every year. I try to be a little more, because I'm a little more fastidious, I try to swap out my underwear every quarter. Yeah, it's a quarterly thing. I mean, since most of American commerce is, based on the quarter system, about every quarter I change my underwear. You don't believe me, do you? How often do you? Thanks for listening to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. Before you hang up, before you turn it off, do me a favor. If you like the content, if you like what we're doing on the podcast, please share the podcast with your friends. It's real easy to do. If you're on Spreaker, there's a share button. On iTunes, there's a share button where you can get the link. But whatever you do, share it with all your friends and help me grow the numbers. And you know the drill. If you want to follow me on social media, all you have to do is go to the website, michaelbrowntoday.com. And across the bottom of the website, you'll see all the social media icons for Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, all of them. So you can follow me on all of those platforms. And I would greatly appreciate it if you would do. And in particular, if you follow us on the Facebook page, facebook.com/Michael D. Brown, then once you like the page, you can ask to join the discussion group. And I actually allow people to post stuff and comments about things I've said or ask me questions inside the discussion group on the Facebook page. But you have to first like the Michael D. Brown Facebook page, which again is at facebook.com/Michael D. Brown. Again, thanks for listening. I'll talk to you tomorrow.